Welcome to Gaining Confidence with Cypress tests. Here's the part where I tell you I am definitely going to post the slides on my site tonight. I've been that person chasing the speaker and it hasn't worked out very well for me either. Which is why you can go to robrich.org. Let's head there now. When you click on presentations here at the top, here's Gaining Confidence with Cypress tests. The slides and the code that we'll see is online right now. While you're here at robrich.org, let's click on About Me and we'll see some of the things that I've done recently. I'm a Cyril developer advocate. If you're having trouble with your data mesh, I would love to talk to you and learn from you. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I'm a Docker captain, a friend of Redgate. AZ Give Camp is really fun. AZ Give Camp brings volunteer developers together with charities to build free software. We start building software Friday after work. Sunday afternoon, we deliver the completed software to the charities. Sleep is optional, caffeine provided. If you're in Phoenix, come join us for the next AZ Give Camp. Or if you'd like a Give Camp here in Romania or wherever you're connecting from, hit me up on email or Twitter and let's get a Give Camp in your neighborhood too. Some of the other things that I've done, I worked on the Gulp team as a core contributor in version 2 and version 3. And one of the things I'm particularly proud of, I replied to a .NET Rocks podcast episode. They read my comment on the air and they sent me a mug. Woohoo! So there's my claim to fame, my coveted .NET Rocks mug. So let's dig into testing. We're going to take a look at Cypress, but let's also take a look at how Cypress fits in context. We talked about this guy. Now, I'm not quite sure how this thing will work out. So let's fire this up and see if my site is working. We may not have gotten all the things ready. So let me just validate that my site is going to function correctly. Doing the TypeScript compile, getting the site ready to go. Yep, it looks like my site is functioning correctly. So I think this talk is going to go really well. Yeah, that worked out well. So that is Cypress, a browser-based functional testing. Or said differently, end-to-end testing, where we're running the browser through various things to be able to validate that our site works correctly. Cypress is an Electron app, and it's a browser plugin. It's built on top of Mocha and Chai. So if you've built any Mocha tests inside JavaScript or TypeScript, then you'll feel right at home. If you've worked with Jasmine or Jest, then it'll be a smooth ride as well. Well, like many good stories, we started in the middle. Let's back up a little bit and talk about how this end-to-end testing fits in context with the other tests that you're going to do. Now, you'll probably do lots of different tests. Integration tests, end-to-end tests, unit tests. Let's take a look at all of these in the context of browser testing. Now, if I was doing testing of an application, I might use a desktop application. I'd use very different tools. But here inside browser testing, I probably have things like end-to-end tests. I have unit tests. I have tests that might validate from here down. I have tests that might validate my API works correctly, my REST endpoint, or my gRPC endpoint. I might test this service. And in this case, I'm talking not so much a web service, but rather a business service, a unit of work. So a unit test. I might test this component. Now I have user interaction. So I need to understand how clicks function and how typing in boxes changes that component. And I might test that these unit tests work in this particular browser. With HTML5, that's less of a concern because browsers have become much more consistent, but it still might be good to validate that, for example, it runs in that version of Chrome and Firefox. So I will use different tools for each of these different types of tests, and I'll probably have some of each of these tests in my solution. Let's take a look at the tools we might use. As you grab these slides from robrich.org, you can click on each of the blue links to learn more about that particular project. If I'm doing a unit test, then I'll probably use Mocha with Chai, or maybe I'll use Jest or Jasmine. If I want to validate that these unit tests work in a particular browser, I'll use Karma. Now, these aren't end-to-end tests. These aren't user interaction tests. These are unit tests running inside of each browser. If I want to take a look at component tests, I'll use Test Utils. Test Utils has a version for Angular, React, and Vue, and others. And so as I pull in Test Utils, I can mount my component, choose to either mock out child components or render them, and then validate the interactions that I want with those web components. If I want to test my API, I don't need a browser at all. I can just fire requests at it, and I can look at HTTP status codes and response bodies. I might use Supertest. And then if I want to use end-to-end tests, I might use Selenium, Cypress, Test Cafe, Playwright, or others. Now, I'm going to have some tests in each of these categories, and so I'll probably use many of these tools. I may not use all of them. I may not have all of these kinds of tests, but I'll probably use multiple sets of tools to accomplish different testing scenarios within my browser app. Let's double click here into the end-to-end tests and take a look at the options that we have here. Selenium. Selenium kind of invented this space, and WebDriver has now kind of become a de facto standard inside of browsers. Selenium tests are great in that we can test drive browsers, but they're really hands-off. They're just kind of moving the mouse and clicking. So Selenium tests tend to be slow and brittle. Well, what happens if our test fails because the page wasn't ready yet? Maybe our API took longer than we expected. We could choose to extend the timeouts in our tests. Now our tests are slower. Or we could just simply rerun our tests. Now our tests are fragile or flaky. And so Selenium is kind of known for this fragile and slow tests. Now, that's okay, but let's see if we can upgrade beyond that. Cypress is a browser plugin. And so the beauty here is that it can listen for DOM events. If the API is done in 10 milliseconds or 2 seconds, then we can continue the test from there. So we don't need to wait a specific amount of time and then go check to see if the browser is ready yet. We can exactly function as soon as the browser is ready. Now, Cypress is great in that it has that deep integration into the browser. The downside is that means that we need a plugin per browser. So right now, there isn't support for Safari. Cypress has a jQuery-like experience. And so it has a .then, but it doesn't function the way you expect, and you can't await it, much like jQuery. Next up, let's take a look at Test Cafe. If you're using Dev Express, Test Cafe might feel right at home. With Test Cafe, we spend a lot of time marshaling between our browser context and our test context. So we'll inject various values inside of the page, various functions inside of the page to be able to harvest values to pull them back into our test. Test Cafe uses CSS selectors, so you'll feel right at home as you do this. They also have great browser support. So if you need Safari, Test Cafe might be a really good choice. Playwright is really interesting as well. Playwright was built by the developers who built Puppeteer. And if ever you've remote controlled Chrome using Puppeteer, then Playwright will feel right at home. Now, Playwright has very similar user experience, very similar API to Puppeteer. And so the assertion syntax feels a little bit of a bolt-on. It isn't based on Mocha with Chai or Jest, and so it's a little odd. It may take some getting used to. Playwright, though, is also built to work in many different languages, where Cypress and Dev Express's product are specifically JavaScript. So if you need support in Python, C#, or Go, then Playwright might be a really good choice. With Playwright, you'll also spend a lot of time marshaling data between the browser and the test, and so that feels a little weird too. So ultimately, you can choose whichever test tool makes the most sense for your environment. And I definitely don't want to dissuade you from your choice, but in this case, I'm going to choose Cypress. Now, Cypress is one of the tools that I'll use in my tool chest of testing tools. I'll also do unit tests either with Jest or with Mocha and Chai. And I'll also probably do component tests with Test Utils. But here, doing end-to-end tests, I'm simulating browser actions to be able to validate that my site works in the critical paths that I need it to. So let's get started with Cypress. The first thing I do is I npm install and I npx Cypress open. Now, the cool part is if I've never run Cypress before, it will scaffold out a whole lot of tests that will test a kitchen sink site that Cypress has built. So now I get a good sense of what content I have available and what options I might have inside of Cypress. It's a really cool experience. Let's take a look at that getting started experience. So let me close this test and let's pull up the Cypress IDE. Now I can choose which browser I run my tests in. Firefox, Edge, Electron is a WebKit-based browser that's baked into this IDE. And in this case, I'm choosing to run them inside the IDE, but I could also run them headless as well. I can now choose to run all of my tests or pick a specific test to run them. Here we can see the example test that Cypress has scaffolded for me. And so I could run one of these to be able to see how this interacts with their website. I'm going to hide these example tests and let's fire up the test that we were looking at previously. Now notice as we launch this test that I have my regular Chrome running here, and this is a different version of Chrome. It has its own profile so that I don't get bleed in from forms that I've filled or websites that I've visited or browser plugins that I have installed. These will run specifically in this alternate Chrome instance to ensure that that data remains separate. Now, as we run the tests, it will run through each of the tests and we can see the content associated with that. So here's where it first loaded the page, and then it'll do this. It's flipping between the request and the response. Then we get some content. Here we'll click on this one and we can see where it found that box that it wanted to get at. As we type into it, there's the spot where it clicked to be able to begin typing. So before it clicked here and after, we can see that that's what it did after it finished clicking or finished typing. We can navigate through our steps and see the results of our tests. I'm going to pull up the F12 developer tools and switch to the console. And we can also see that it includes the results at each step as well. So we can navigate up and down our tests and we can view the content associated with that step. Additionally, if I wanted to debug my test, I can come here into sources and I can set a breakpoint and then restart my test and use standard web development tools, F10, F11, to be able to step through and step into different pieces of my test. I'm going to undo this breakpoint and close the developer tools. We also see that we kind of have this fake browser experience. Here's the URL that we're viewing. And so we can now use this tool to be able to pick various things. If I wanted to grab this paragraph, then this is the selector that I might want to use. Now we'll dig into making really good selectors in a bit. So maybe this isn't the most efficient experience to get at this one, but I like that I can browse through and use that to make selections. I can choose to rerun my tests and I can see the number of succeeding and failing tests and the time it took to run my tests. And it's really cool. In this case, we've got all passing tests. That's perfect. Now, this was in that separate Chrome profile, and we chose to run a single test, but we could also choose to run all the tests, and we could choose to run them headlessly from our DevOps pipeline as well. So we got to see the Cypress IDE. Let's take a look at the code to pull this off. By default, a Cypress project will be in JavaScript, but in this case, I chose to make it a TypeScript project just because, well, TypeScript is pretty cool. So I popped open the code. Here's the code up on GitHub. And in this case, I'm going to pop open that in VS Code. And let's take a look around. Our first stop is this cypress.json file. Now, this explains to Cypress where all of the pieces are. In particular, here's the plugins file. And I've chosen to put this inside the tests folder, inside the Cypress folder, plugins/index. So here's that plugins index file. And here is the details of where all of the rest of the configuration is. So I've got the fixtures folder here, right here. I've got my integration folder, which is where all my tests are. I've got my screenshots folder and my videos folder, and I've chosen to put these in a results folder so that I can specifically exclude that from my Git repository and not accidentally check in test results. And then support file, here's my support file right here. So in this case, I chose to make it a TypeScript project. So at the base of my project, I'll have my standard TypeScript config file. Now this will apply to all of the details of my application. And notice how it doesn't have any details specific to Cypress. Inside my Cypress folder, I have a second tsconfig file, and this tsconfig file is specific to Cypress. Now, because I have two different websites, I have two different tsconfig files that allow me to harvest both of these results. Now, in this case, I don't need to specify all the things. I'm just going to specify that it extends that base tsconfig.json and then override the properties that I need. So I need to add the Cypress types. I need to include the Cypress content inside my compile step, and I'll set the base URL back to that original folder. So that's the tsconfig, and now that allows me to build up that content inside of TypeScript. So rather than just having .js files, I'll have .ts files instead. Inside my package.json, I chose to include a couple of scripts. Now, we could do npx cypress open, or in this case, I said cy:\open. So now I can say npm run cy open, and that will open the IDE. By comparison, if I want to run headless, here's cy:\run, and I can specify specific details. In this case, I've said I want to specifically run headless. That is the default. And I also want to run inside Chrome. I'll also run headless inside of Firefox and run headless inside of Edge. So I have these three commands that will allow me to run in each of those browsers. So when I say npm test, it will run in Chrome, and it will run in Firefox, and it will run in Edge. And if all three of those tests succeed in all three of those browsers, then I know my site is functioning correctly. Now, these definitely don't run in parallel, so there's definitely some optimization to be had here. But now I've got scripts inside of my package.json that allow me to run in headless mode and to open the IDE really easily. Now, we popped open this to-do MVC app, this to-do MVC tester. And so let's pop open to-do MVC and take a look at it. Here's that to-do MVC site. Now, this is maybe a smidge dated, but the goal was, given an HTML file and a CSS file, build a front-end application in all of the frameworks. So we have one for AngularJS, Vue, Backbone, Polymer, lots of different projects. And so this test, you'll notice it kept running while I was flipped into a different browser, is going to test the that site. So popping open the code for this, here's my to-do MVC test. We could flip between various site URLs. In this case, I'll do the AngularJS version. Now, I grabbed the site name just so that I could put it in my describe block. And then before each, I'm going to visit that site URL. Now, I could definitely do this at the beginning of every test, but I kind of like doing it before each, because now I know by the time my test starts, I've already loaded that page and I'm ready to go. Okay, so let's do a first hello world test. It should visit page. Now we can see cy.url. I'm grabbing the URL from the current page, and it should equal that site URL. We can kind of see the jQuery influence here. All else being equal, I would rather this be more like Mocha, where it was be should dot equal and pass in the site URL. But yeah, that's not how it is. We we have a magic string. That's okay. Now, I really enjoy this Hello World test. For as simple as it is, when I first built this talk, these were HTTP URLs instead of HTTPS URLs. And so when they flipped it over to HTTPS, then I got to test that this page wasn't as I expected. My test failed, and helped me understand that maybe we had changed the scope of our website. And so maybe I'm not testing what I expect. So we got to do a great Hello World test, go grab the URL of the current page, and validate that we're on the correct page that we think we're testing. Let's level up a little bit and start interacting with the page. Let's go get this to-do list and look for all the LI items. Now, we haven't typed anything in the to-do items box yet, so far it should not exist. That's perfect. We've pulled up the to-dos, we haven't interacted with it, so it should be blank. If we were using a shared profile rather than this unique Chrome, then we might have gotten some details from previous runs that might pollute these results. So I'm really glad that we launch in a separate Chrome profile. Let's level up again and take a look at how we might interact with the page. Now you'll see this arrange, act, and assert pattern, and this is really helpful in being able to set up what we need for our test and then do the things that we need to do, and then assert that those results are as we expect. So we'll see this arrange, act, assert pattern in all of our tests. Now, yes, technically the arrange step does also include the cy.visit step at the beginning. We'll just take that for granted that that's available before we begin. We want to create a new to-do. And so here's our to-do text. So let's go find that .new to-do box and then type in it. There's that jQuery type of field again. We'll type that new to-do and then we'll push enter. Notice how this one is blue and this one isn't. We have the $ here so that it uses that string interpolation. This one does not. This is just the curly braces specifying a key, in this case, the enter key. We could do this with the shift key, option key, control key, function keys, any key that you can type on your keyboard, you can list here as a key. So we can test various interactions when we're holding various buttons, or in this case, just typing the enter key. So we'll type the new to do and push enter. And notice that we're not awaiting it. By the time this statement finishes, we know that we've typed it and we know that all of the JavaScript events and browser events have happened by the time we hit our next line. So let's go look at that to-do list, and it should now contain this new to-do. We've got this string and we're validating that our new to-do is in place. Let's also get the box that we typed in and validate that it has a blank value. So we know that we've typed a new to-do, and we know that we've been able to create that to-do in our to-do list. Let's level up again and start to click on the buttons in our page. I'm going to create an irrelevant to-do just so that as I mark one as completed, I know that I'm completing the correct one. We'll push enter. Then let's type our new to-do, also push enter. Now I have two to-dos in my list. So let me go find the to-do that I want, and I'll filter based on having this text in its result. Now that's a little hokey, the CSS selector with a filter text, but yeah, that gets us through the day. Then we'll go look for the children, we'll look for that toggle button, and we will click it. So I've clicked that toggle button, and now that one to-do is marked as complete. I'm going to go validate that my list now my to-do should have a class of completed, and that's where I get that strike through field. Now I'm not validating that visually it has a strike through, rather I'm just validating that it has that completed class. Let's level up again and start to interact with the page in more interesting ways. I'm going to create a new to-do. I'm also going to create this irrelevant to-do, so let's create those two. And now I want to delete a to-do. Now, the delete box is only visible when we hover over an item. So let's come to this stage. When I hover over the item, that delete box is available. But if I'm not hovered, then I don't see that delete box. So here in my test, we're not running CSS events. We're not running, we're not moving the mouse. So we don't have that visual in our screen. So in this case, we're going to go grab that destroy button, but we need to say force is true to be able to click something that is not visible on the page. Now that's totally fine. Previously, we could just click it. It was visible. In this case, we just say force is true, and we'll click it even though it is not visible. Okay, so we marked that one as deleted. And so now if we go look at our list, we should only have one, and that one should be our relevant to-do. Double checking that we didn't accidentally delete the wrong to-do. That was great. We were able to click on a button even though it wasn't visible on the page and interact with our page as a user would. Now let's start doing our filtering processes. If we come in here and we filter by all or active or completed, then we'll see only those items in our list that match that criteria. So first, let's only show active tasks. Now, previously we've done this. We've typed some text and we pushed enter, and that gets kind of verbose. We're not really explaining what the user is doing. Rather, we're telling Cypress the commands that we need to do. What if we had a to-do add command? That would be really elegant. So let me just pass in that message and go create a new to-do with to-do add. This is where we have commands. So I have a command here that says I have this to-do add function. I've given it what that function will do. So it'll go grab that new to-do box, type in it, and hey, while I'm here, I may as well just validate that it's now blank. So with this to-do command, I can now to-do add my irrelevant to-do, to-do add another to-do add my new to-do, and I've got all of those in place. I'm starting to describe my functions in the way that a user might do this. And the details of those are back here in my commands. If ever you've used Selenium's page object, you'll feel right at home with commands. This makes my tests much more descriptive and terse. Now, I do need to, in this case, teach TypeScript how to use these. So I'll head off to the Cypress docs and let's take a look at how we do this. So we'll add this command, but then we'll also create a type declaration file that describes how this command works, returning a chainable of elements so that it knows how to continue on if we continue with this. So back in our commands, we have this command file that is the actual implementation, and then we have that type declaration file explaining that that method does exist, much like, say, a C header file. So now that we've created this to-do add command, we've also created this to-do complete command, and that to-do complete command will do a similar thing. It will go find that toggle button and click it. So now we've created 3 to-dos, we'll complete one, and we can see that our test is much more descriptive, where we're explaining what we need to do. Let's go find that active button and we'll click it. And now we can go validate that we only have 2 left. Perfect. Let's use those commands again. I like how terse this is. And we'll go find the completed button, click that, and validate that now we only have 1 item in the list. Should clear completed tasks, just to be thorough, we'll go click that. And once we've created the to-do, completed it, and then clear completed, we should now have no items in our list. So this was great to be able to level up through all of those pieces. Let's also take a look at how we might do network commands. We're going to take a look at, let's stop this, and let's start up this other test. We looked at to-do MVC, and to-do MVC was a great way of being able to look at all of the different websites. Hacker News PWA is kind of that spiritual successor to to-do MVC, where they create a Hacker News client in each of the spas. So here's a React one, another React one, a Preact one. Now this is great, but this is going to pull the actual news from Hacker News. So how do I validate that my control renders correctly? I don't know what that top story is going to be. Now, as we look through our tests, we can see that all of our tests pass. Let's take a look at the code that accomplishes that. When I'm looking at Hacker News PWA, I can pick from those various sites. And in this case, I'm just going to use my Angular 2 one. I'll do that first test, the hello world, that will just validate that my site is what I expect. That helps me to know that maybe the site was refactored and that page no longer exists. Now let's check to see if we have a specific top story. I don't know what Hacker News is going to load, and so I want to intercept this request and replace it with this fixture. Now we can use regular expressions here, as I did, but we could also use strings. I kind of like that regular expression though. And so I'm going to go grab this fixture, this Hacker News fixture. And this now is hard-coded results. It's not going to hit the actual API. It will use these. And so I know that this will be the title of the first story. So I've got that title right here, and I can go visit that site and validate that the first post has that title. Now, it would be really easy for us to mock out the API and lie to ourselves that that is the way the API behaves. So let's also create another story that goes and loads the real content from Hacker News. Now, I don't know what the top story will be, but I'm pretty sure that Hacker News has at least 30 stories. So I'll validate that we have the first page and it's full. Now, if this request took a really long time, I could mark this as a specific name and then choose to wait for that. But by default, its current timeout is fine. And so we see that our test passed just fine. So in this case, we were able to run one test that mocked out the results and one test that loaded the real results. So we wouldn't pretend that we knew how that API worked. That was really fun. We got to dig through lots of different experiences inside of Cypress and see how we could level up through interactions of clicking on the page, typing on the page, clicking buttons, and ultimately looking at network requests. Let's look at some best practices associated with Cypress. Now, our first step is in selectors. We didn't do a lot with selectors because in this case, I was testing somebody else's site, not my own site. But if we're controlling both the site and the tests, then we should avoid using really deep XPath selectors or CSS selectors, instead focusing on IDs or classes. Now that'll get us so far, but if we refactor our site and move things around, we might choose to alter the styling, which would remove those CSS classes or change the ID. Even better, we should create a data-cy element on each of the pieces that we want to control. And then in our test, we can just select the data-cy element that has that particular thing. And now we've exactly highlighted the piece that we wanted to test. The other benefit here is that now in our code, we've highlighted that a test applies to this code. If I'm messing with a page and I see a data-cy tag, I know that I may need to touch up a test associated with this. Now, some might argue, wait, I'm leaking my testing details into production. Well, yes, and that's a wonderful thing. Wouldn't it be cool if you could run your tests in production? Now, you probably don't want to get through the part where you're putting in a credit card number or making a purchase, but wouldn't it be great to be able to hit the homepage, go into the product catalog, put something in your shopping cart, get to the payment page, and validate that all of that works correctly, maybe once a day or once an hour? Wouldn't it be great if you knew if your site broke before your customers couldn't make purchases? Grab those hot paths and test them in production. And this data-cy element makes that possible. It also documents your purpose in the test. So you can say, yes, this has a particular test associated with it. Next up, create commands for frequent tasks. The more that you can create commands, the more that your tests are really terse and descriptive. And if ever the logic behind that changes, then you know you can just alter that command and it'll apply to all the tests that use it. This is great for making your test really descriptive. And now you can kind of look through the test and see the intent of the user, not just the actions that they needed to take. If ever you used Selenium's page objects, you'll feel right at home. As you grab these slides from robrich.org, click on the blue link and you can learn more about building commands and especially with TypeScript. As you're doing logins, you probably want to validate your login procedure, but you don't want to do it at every request. Instead, test it once and then do a before all that will go grab a token you can use for the rest of the test. Pass in this token into each test, and now you can make that process a lot speedier. The login process is important, but you don't need to test it 5,000 times if you have 5,000 unit tests. Next up, use fixtures for mock data. If you have a standard username or password, or you have a whole bunch of JSON data that needs to be in your test, move that to a fixture and include that fixture in your test. That makes your test more terse and possibly makes it possible to reuse that data as well. In our case, we used a fixture to grab the details from Hacker News. And so we could put in the top story, and now we could validate that that is the story that we expect. Now, mocks for API responses are really helpful using cy.intercept, but we also want to be careful not to lie to ourselves and completely mock out that API. Use some tests that use mocks if you want to validate how a particular response renders into a control, and then do other tests that validate that your mocks match the real API results. Grab these slides from robrich.org, click on the blue link, and you can see how to use cy.intercept. This has been a lot of fun getting to show you how Cypress makes end-to-end testing really fun. If ever you've tried end-to-end testing and you've not had a whole lot of success, give Cypress a try. You can make really successful end-to-end tests inside Cypress. If you're watching this video later, hit me up on Twitter at Rob_Rich, and I'd love to continue the conversation. The slides and the code are available right now on robrich.org. And for those of us here in the event, what are your questions?